What if the plants you tend with such loving care are the very things preventing God's grace from purifying your home? Not plants in someone else's garden, yours. The ones you water, the ones you've arranged just so, the ones that have been sitting in your home for years without raising a single suspicion. Saint Teresa of Avila identified them. There are 4, and they are found in more devout Catholic homes than anyone would dare imagine, living alongside crucifixes, images of Our Lady, blessed rosaries, silently blocking something that no prayer can fully penetrate while they remain in place. Nobody had ever put it to you quite this way. Nobody had ever called what is happening in your home by its true name until today. Saint Teresa of Avila understood that the Christian home is not simply a physical space. It is spiritual territory, with boundaries that open or close depending on what inhabits it. During her years of founding convents, she would enter the homes of devout families who prayed with great fervor, and yet something wouldn't yield. The peace they prayed for never quite settled in. The protection they sought never arrived with the fullness they expected. And it was through those encounters that she began identifying with remarkable precision what was standing in the way of purification. She wrote it down, she passed it on, and today it reaches you because you need it. If you feel that your home carries a heaviness you cannot explain, despite your faith, write in the comments right now, Saint Teresa of Avila, purify my home. And subscribe to this channel right now, because these teachings don't find their way everywhere. And you found them because you were meant to. What comes next was kept for you. There is something happening in your home right now that you cannot see. Not with your eyes, not with any human sense. But Saint Teresa of Avila saw it. She described it. She identified it with a precision that left even her closest sisters astonished. But because she did not speak of the soul, as though it was something separate from the body, something floating above daily life, untouched by walls or objects or the plants tucked into the corners of a house. For Saint Teresa of Avila, the soul lives within an environment, and that environment shapes it. It either sets the soul free or holds it back. And when that environment is out of order, the soul feels it, even when it cannot find the words for what it feels. You have felt it. I am certain you have felt it at some point. That experience of kneeling down to pray and sensing that something won't open. That your words go out but don't seem to rise. That the silence after the Our Father feels less like peace and more like weight. That in a particular room or corner, or that spot in your home where you place the image of Our Lady or the crucifix you inherited from your grandmother, something resists, something won't yield, and you've prayed more, lit more candles, asked more earnestly, and still that resistance remains, like an invisible wall that no one else seems to notice, but that you know well because you've been running into it for years every time you try to pray with any real depth. Saint Teresa of Avila knew that wall. She had encountered it herself before she understood where it came from. And it was precisely that personal struggle, that wrestling with the environment of her own prayer, that led her to pay a kind of attention to physical space that very few contemplatives of her era ever considered. In the book of her life, she writes about the years when her prayer was dry, interrupted, labored, and how she gradually learned to discern what belonged to her soul and what belonged to what surrounded her. That discernment became one of the most tangible fruits of her entire mystical life, and she passed it on. Because Saint Teresa of Avila never kept what she learned to herself. She shared it with her sisters, with the families who sought her out in the parlors of her convents, with the spiritual directors who came to her with cases they could not resolve. And again, when they described devout households where peace wouldn't come, where prayer felt blocked, where a heaviness resisted every novena, she would ask the same question that no one ever expected. She didn't ask how often they prayed. She didn't ask whether they went to confession regularly. She asked what was in the house, what objects, what plants, what elements of the physical environment shared space with the sacramentals and the sacred images without anyone ever having examined whether they belonged to the same spiritual order. That question startled everyone at first, because in the 16th century, just as today, most faithful Catholics drew a clear line between the spiritual and the material. The sacred realm was the soul, prayer, the sacraments. The physical world was simply the backdrop where all of that took place, a neutral stage, indifferent, neither helping nor hindering the interior life. But Saint Teresa of Avila had come to understand that this line does not exist, that matter is not neutral in the face of grace, that the supernatural order includes the physical environment in the same way it includes the acts of the soul, and that there are material elements that open a path for grace and material elements that block it, not because they have any power of their own, but because they belong to spiritual orders that are not compatible with the order of God. This is precisely what the Church has always taught through the doctrine of sacramentals. Blessed objects are not magic. They are signs that within faith dispose the environment to receive grace with greater freedom. But that disposition can be disrupted. It can be blocked by the presence of elements that belong to another spirituality, another tradition, another set of meanings that contradicts the Christian order, even when no one in the household knows it and no one chose it deliberately. Ignorance does not undo the effect. And Saint Teresa of Avila knew this, so when she entered a home and felt that resistance that families described with such anguish, she looked at the environment with the same eyes she used to read the soul. And sometimes, in the midst of that contemplative gaze, she found the answer in the most unexpected place. Not in the souls of those who were praying, not in some hidden sin, not in a lack of faith, but in something green and silent that had been sitting at the heart of the home for months, sometimes years, without anyone suspecting what it was doing. The 4 plants that Saint Teresa of Avila warned against are not evil plants in and of themselves. They are plants that belong to spiritual traditions foreign to Christianity, plants that have accumulated in the collective imagination a symbolic weight that is incompatible with the order of grace, or plants that popular devotion has associated for centuries with practices the Church has never blessed. And when those plants share space with the sacred, when they coexist with holy images and sacramentals, they create exactly what you have felt without being able to name it. A wall, an invisible ceiling, a door that never quite opens, no matter how genuine and deep and sincere the faith of the person praying. Now listen carefully, because what follows is what Saint Teresa of Avila identified by name, with description, with a specific warning she left for households exactly like yours. And the first of these 4 plants is perhaps the most widespread in Catholic homes throughout the Spanish-speaking world, the most beloved, the one that surprises people most when they hear its name in this context, because nobody looks at it with suspicion. Nobody would ever imagine that this particular plant could be a problem. And yet Saint Teresa of Avila saw it, and what she saw led her to issue a warning with a clarity that left no room for doubt. The first plant Saint Teresa of Avila warned against has no thorns. It has nothing dark or threatening about it, quite the opposite. It is a plant with glossy leaves, a green so deep and vivid it almost looks artificial. And it grows with an ease that delights anyone who tends it, because it needs very little water, very little light, very little effort. And that is precisely why it is everywhere. In the living rooms of modest homes and the hallways of grand ones, in elderly people's bedrooms and on young people's desks, in hospitals, offices, markets, and in Catholic homes throughout Latin America, sitting alongside the image of the Sacred Heart and the Rosary hanging on the wall, as if there were no contradiction at all between its presence and the presence of the sacred. It is called Pothos, In some places, it is known as epipremnum. In others, it is simply called the money plant. And that name alone should give us pause, because it is not an accident. The name reveals its symbolic origin, and that origin is precisely the problem. Pothos has no roots in the Christian tradition. Its roots lie in the tradition of feng shui, the energy-based philosophy of Chinese origin that organizes physical space according to flows of energy that Eastern spirituality calls qi, and that has no correspondence whatsoever with the Christian supernatural order. Within that tradition, the pothos is placed in the home to attract prosperity, to stir stagnant energy, to open channels of material abundance. It is, in the language of that spirituality, a plant of power, a plant that actively works within the energetic space of the home with an intention that is neither neutral nor Christian. Now, does this mean that anyone who has a pothos plant has committed a sin? Absolutely not. The vast majority of families who keep this plant know nothing of its origin. They bought it because it was inexpensive and attractive. They received it as a gift. They propagated it because it grows so readily and passed cuttings along to neighbors and friends. There was no intention, no knowledge. But Saint Teresa of Avila, and this is crucial to understand, was not speaking about intentions when she spoke about the environment of the home. She was speaking about order. And spiritual order does not depend solely on the intention of the heart. It also depends on what is present in the space. She learned this in her own convents. There were objects that her sisters kept out of affection, out of habit, out of simple ignorance of their origin. And yet those objects created an interference in the atmosphere of prayer that Saint Teresa of Avila could detect with that contemplative sensitivity that years of interior life had developed in her to an extraordinary degree. And her response was always the same. Not judgment, not condemnation, just clarity. This does not belong here. Remove it peacefully. And then watch what happens. What happened afterward, according to the testimonies of her sisters, recorded in the beatification proceedings, was almost always the same thing. An opening, a lightness in the atmosphere, a new ease in prayer that had previously taken tremendous effort to sustain, as if something that had been pressing down had been lifted, and no one had realized how heavy it was until the moment it was gone. This is what Saint Teresa of Avila wanted families to understand about the pothos and about plants whose roots lie in spiritualities foreign to Christianity. Not that they are dangerous in the dramatic sense the world gives to that word, but that they create interference, spiritual noise, a frequency that does not harmonize with the frequency of Christian grace. And that, when it shares space with the sacred, produces exactly that experience which so many devout families know all too well and cannot name. The prayer that never quite lifts off the ground, the rosary that gets said but never truly felt, the novena that ends without anything seeming to shift, the Sunday Mass that doesn't quite fill the emptiness of the week. And here is something Saint Teresa of Avila would emphasize with particular insistence when speaking of these kinds of interference. The harm is not dramatic. It is not spectacular. There are no frightening phenomena, no alarming signs. The harm is silent. It is a slow, quiet withdrawal of something that should be there and simply isn't. An imperceptible diminishing of the grace that the home ought to be accumulating through the daily prayers of those who live in it. Like a vessel with a crack so small that nobody sees it, but that keeps the water from ever quite reaching the brim, no matter how faithfully you keep filling it. How many years have you been filling that vessel? How many rosaries, novenas, and communions has your home accumulated without peace ever fully settling in, with the fullness that God wants to give you? Saint Teresa of Avila had an answer to that question, and it didn't begin with the soul. It began with looking at the environment through new eyes, the eyes of someone who knows that the physical space where faith is lived is not an indifferent backdrop, but a living part of the path toward God. The second plant she warned against has an even older history. And when you hear its name, you will understand immediately why Saint Teresa of Avila, who knew the history of the Church and the history of religions with a depth that astonished her contemporaries, pointed to it so clearly. Because this plant did not find its way into Catholic homes by carelessness. It arrived through a confusion that has centuries of history behind it. And that confusion is precisely the doorway through which the blockage enters. The second plant has a name that sounds innocent, that sounds even like purity. For many people, it calls to mind images of peaceful gardens, shaded courtyards, grandmothers who tended it with a kind of devotion they could not fully explain, because they had learned it that way from their own mothers and grandmothers, in an unbroken chain of custom that no one had ever interrupted to ask where the tradition actually came from. It is called Rue, and its story is one of the most complex threads that Saint Teresa of Avila had to untangle when she found it settled in homes that presented themselves to her as deeply Catholic. Rue appears in virtually every culture in the world. The ancient Greeks used it. The Romans cultivated it in their gardens and attributed to it powers ranging from protection against the evil eye to the ability to drive away malicious spirits. In pre-Columbian America, there were already plants of similar function that the conquistadors and missionaries found woven into religious practices the Church identified from the outset as incompatible with Christianity. And when Rue arrived on the American continent with European colonizers, something occurred that historians of popular religion know well: a blending, a merging, a layering of meanings in which the plant became simultaneously associated with Catholic devotion and with spiritual protection practices that the Church had never blessed. And that blending is exactly the problem Saint Teresa of Avila identified with such clarity. Not the plant itself, not its botanical properties which traditional medicine has valued for centuries, but the symbolic weight it carries. The place it occupies in the spiritual imagination of millions of people, a place that is not Christian, even when it is tangled up with images of saints and prayers learned in childhood. Because a plant that in the collective unconscious is associated with magical protection, with the evil eye, with cleansing rituals that have no root in the Church's tradition, carries that association with it when it enters a Christian home. It does not matter that the person who plants it is a devout woman who attends Mass every Sunday. The symbolic weight does not dissolve because of the good intentions of the one who tends it. Saint Teresa of Avila, who had read the Church Fathers with uncommon depth for her era, knew well the theological principle underlying this warning. Grace does not blend. It does not peaceably coexist in the same space with what belongs to a different spiritual order without consequence. Sacramentals function within an order. They are effective within that order. But when that order is disrupted, when elements of the Christian tradition share a space with elements of traditions operating by a different spiritual logic, the effectiveness of the sacramentals is diminished. Not because God withholds His grace out of displeasure, but because the environment is no longer disposed to receive it with the same freedom. She saw this play out in concrete situations. There are testimonies from her Carmelite sisters describing how Saint Teresa of Avila, upon visiting certain convents where popular religious customs had become entangled with community life, without anyone ever examining their origins, would identify with startling swiftness the elements creating the interference, and Rue appeared frequently, planted beside the herbs in the convent garden, placed in bundles near the sacred images, carried in the pockets of sisters who had grown up in family traditions where its protective power was simply taken for granted. Saint Teresa of Avila did not scold them harshly. She instructed them with patience. She explained the difference between the protection that comes from grace and the protection that superstition seeks in matter, and she asked them to choose, to bring order to their inner home and their outer home with equal clarity. because that is the teaching underlying her entire warning about plants. It is not about removing something harmful in order to be left with nothing. It is about making room for something far better. Grace does not need to compete with anything, but it does need an uncluttered environment to flow with the freedom God intends to give it. And a home where rue coexists with holy water, and a crucifix is a home where two different spiritual orders are attempting to occupy the same space. And that silent conflict produces exactly the heaviness, the dryness, the sense of a locked door that so many devout families know without ever understanding. Do you have rue in your home? In the garden, in the pot near the front door, in the little herb patch you tend with care? Perhaps you put it there because someone told you it keeps harm away. Perhaps it has always been there, and you never thought to ask why. Perhaps it is the same plant your mother transplanted from her home to yours, as though it were an heirloom, and it is. But it is an inheritance that carries within it a history that is now worth examining through the eyes of the mature faith Saint Teresa of Avila, wanted for every Christian who took their interior life seriously. The third plant she warned against comes from even further away. It comes from a spiritual tradition that in recent years has entered millions of homes with a speed that would have bewildered Saint Teresa of Avila. Not because of how far it traveled, but because of the ease with which Catholic households have welcomed it without asking a single question about what it brings with it. And what it brings is something no devout family would ever want in the room where their children are learning to pray. The third plant comes from the East. Not the Holy Land, not the olive groves of Galilee or the gardens where Jesus prayed. It comes from a spiritual tradition thousands of years old that in recent decades has crossed every ocean with the ease the modern world enables, often without anyone realizing what is being carried along with the seeds and cuttings. It is called lucky bamboo. And in Catholic homes throughout the Spanish-speaking world, it is present in proportions that astonish anyone who begins to pay attention. In living rooms, kitchens, bathrooms, on desks, beside statues of the saints, next to rosaries, next to images of the Divine Child and Our Lady of Guadalupe, as if it were just another decorative piece, as innocent a presence as any seasonal flower. It is not. And Saint Teresa of Avila, had she seen this plant settled at the heart of a Christian home, would have said exactly what she said about all the others, calmly, clearly, without drama, without fear. This plant does not belong here. Lucky bamboo, whose botanical name is Dracaena sanderiana, has no roots in the Christian tradition whatsoever. Its symbolic origin lies in Taoism and in Chinese spiritual traditions that organize the universe according to principles of energetic balance that have no correspondence with Christian theology. Within those traditions, lucky bamboo is not a decoration. It is a spiritual power object, something placed in the home with a specific intention, to attract favorable energies, to balance cosmic forces, to open channels of prosperity and good fortune according to a spiritual logic that is complete and coherent within its own system, but entirely foreign to the supernatural order that the Catholic faith recognizes as true. This is what makes its presence in the Christian home problematic, not its appearance, not its ease of care, not its price, which is usually quite low, but the fact that it is a spiritual power object belonging to a non-Christian tradition, placed in a space where Christian grace is trying to flow freely and creating by its very presence exactly the kind of interference Saint Teresa of Avila described when she spoke of environments that block prayer. In her own words, Saint Teresa of Avila wrote something in the way of perfection that illuminates this teaching with a clarity the centuries have not been able to dim. Speaking of the dispositions necessary for prayer, she wrote that the soul seeking to reach God must be stripping away everything that is not God, because the Lord is so fond of order that any disorder in the environment of the soul, interior or exterior, creates a distance that is not of God's making but of ours. That distance. That is the precise word. The distance you feel when you pray and the sky seems further away than usual. The distance that settles between your genuine faith and the fruits that faith ought to be bearing in your home and in your family. Saint Teresa of Avila knew that distance has causes, and some of those causes live in the physical environment where the soul spends its days. Lucky bamboo creates that distance in a particular way, because it is not simply an object from another culture. It is an object that in its tradition of origin has an active spiritual function. It is there to do something, to move something, to draw something in. And that original intention does not disappear because the person who bought it was unaware of it. Matter retains its history. Objects carry within them the meaning their tradition has assigned them across centuries. And when that meaning comes into conflict with the order of grace, the conflict is real, even if no one in the home sees it or feels it in any dramatic way. What is felt, and Saint Teresa of Avila described this with a precision her spiritual directors found extraordinary, is a diminishment, an imperceptible reduction in the home's capacity to accumulate grace. The prayer gets said, but something is lost along the way. Holy Communion is received, but its fruit doesn't last as long as it should. The priest's blessing arrives, but does not settle with the firmness the home needs to be truly God's territory. And the family lives in a genuine, sincere devotion that never quite produces the fruits that faith promises, without understanding why, without being able to point to any reason that explains it. Now you understand why Saint Teresa of Avila placed such emphasis on examining the environment. Not because the environment matters more than the soul, but because the environment is part of the soul when we are speaking of the Christian home. What surrounds the family that prays is part of their spiritual life in a way that the modern world has forgotten, but that the tradition of the Church has always known. And recovering that knowledge, applying it with the serenity and clarity that Saint Teresa of Avila always wanted for her spiritual children, is precisely what you are doing right now by listening to these words with an open heart. You now know 3 of the 4 plants, 3 plants that are in millions of devout homes at this very moment, quietly blocking the purification that God wants to pour out upon those families. But the force is different. The force will surprise you the most, because it does not come from the East. It has its origin in no exotic spiritual tradition. The 4th plant has been in Catholic homes for so long that no one looks at it with any suspicion. No one would ever imagine this particular plant could be a problem. And yet, once you hear what Saint Teresa of Avila saw in it, you will never be able to look at it quite the same way again. The 4th plant is the closest to home, the most familiar, the hardest to mention in this context, precisely because no one would ever associate it with a spiritual blockage. It grows in the yards of the most humble homes and in the gardens of the finest estates. Grandmothers tend it with the same love they bring to their devotions. They connect it with cleanliness, with freshness, with family tradition. In many Latin American households, it is practically a member of the family, a presence so ancient and so beloved that removing it would feel almost like a betrayal of something we cannot name but feel as our own. It is called sabila, or, as the rest of the world knows it, aloe vera. And before the heart closes and the mind says, "This is too much, hear me out." Because what Saint Teresa of Avila warned about aloe vera has nothing to do with its medicinal properties, which the Church has never questioned, nor with the love with which your grandmother tended it, which was genuine and beautiful. It has to do with the place this plant occupies in the syncretic religious landscape that has coexisted alongside Latin American Catholicism for centuries, without most of the faithful ever realizing what was happening in the spiritual environment of their homes. Aloe vera is not simply a medicinal plant in the Latin American popular tradition. It is a ritual plant. in syncretic traditions, in Santeria, in Spiritism, in the practices of spiritual cleansing passed down through generations mixed with superficially Catholic elements. It holds a central place. It is hung in doorways to protect the home, placed at thresholds to ward off evil, used in purification rituals that have no root in the doctrine of the Church, but rather in spiritual traditions that the magisterium has consistently identified as incompatible with Christian faith. Did your grandmother know this? In all likelihood, no. She would almost certainly have reacted with indignation to any suggestion that her customs were not entirely Catholic. She learned them from her mother, who learned them from hers, in a chain of transmission reaching back through generations where popular Catholicism absorbed elements of other spiritualities without anyone naming it or examining it. That does not make your grandmother a person of deficient faith. It makes her a daughter of her time and her culture. But it does mean that the plant she placed by the door of your home carries with it a symbolic weight that is not Christian, an association with practices the Church does not bless. And that weight remains in the home's environment, even when no one knows about it and no one consciously chose it. Saint Teresa of Avila understood this better than almost anyone, because she herself had grown up in a Spain where popular religious practice blended with remarkable ease elements of the Christian tradition with remnants of other spiritualities that centuries of cultural coexistence had left layered into the customs of ordinary people. And one of the most important tasks of her Carmelite reform was precisely this: to cleanse, to purify, not with violence or condemnation, but with the loving clarity of one who knows that God deserves a clean space, and that the soul seeking Him deserves an environment that does not stand in its way. When she spoke of purifying the environment in her letters to the spiritual directors of families who consulted her, Saint Teresa of Avila used an image her correspondents never forgot. She said that the Christian home is like the tabernacle of a church, not in the same degree of holiness, but in the same principle of order. No one would place beside the tabernacle an object belonging to another spiritual tradition. No one would mix on the same sacred altar elements from different religions, because it would be understood immediately that this is not enrichment but confusion, and that confusion does not invite the presence of God but complicates it. The same, she said, is true in the home. The same logic, the same consequences. The aloe vera hanging at your door, the aloe in the pot in the back garden that no one has moved in decades, the plant your neighbor gave you telling you it brings protection and good luck. It is there with a symbolic intention that is not Christian, even if the one who placed it was a woman who prayed the rosary every day. And that intention creates in the home's environment precisely the kind of interference Saint Teresa of Avila described. Not a dramatic danger, not something to fear, but a silent interference, one that reduces the freedom with which grace can move through that space, that sets two spiritual orders in quiet competition with each other in a place that ought to belong wholly to God. Now you have all four: the Pothos, with its roots in Eastern energetic tradition; the Rue, with its centuries-long history of blending Catholicism with folk magical protection; lucky bamboo, with its active spiritual function within a non-Christian tradition; and aloe vera, with its central role in the syncretic religious life that has lived for centuries alongside popular Catholicism, without anyone ever examining it in the light of the mature faith Saint Teresa of Avila wanted for every Christian serious about their interior life. 4 plants, 4 silent sources of interference, 4 reasons why there are devout homes where grace cannot flow with the freedom God intends to give it. But there is something Saint Teresa of Avila wanted you to understand before you get up to remove them. Something that completely changes the meaning of this warning and transforms what might seem like a loss into a doorway to something far greater than you can imagine. Before we speak of what Saint Teresa of Avila wanted you to understand, it is worth pausing for a moment on something that may be happening in you right now. Because there is a reaction, very human and entirely understandable, that arises when we hear what you have just heard. And Saint Teresa of Avila knew it well, because she had seen it in the sisters of her convents, in the families who came to her, in the spiritual directors who sometimes felt it themselves when she pointed something out they had never noticed. It is the reaction of someone who feels that what they loved was a mistake, that what they inherited was wrong, that the years of sincere devotion lived alongside those plants were years of an error they had no chance to correct because no one ever told them. Saint Teresa of Avila had a response to that reaction, and it is the most important part of her warning, more important even than the names of the 4 plants, because without it, the warning becomes guilt. And guilt was never Saint Teresa of Avila's intention when she spoke of these things. Her response was this: God does not charge us for what we did not know. Ignorance does not close heaven. Ignorance only asks to be illuminated. And when the soul receives that light with humility and acts on it, grace does not merely return. It returns with an abundance that makes up for all the time it was held back. Because God, Saint Teresa of Avila, would say this with the filial confidence that marked all her spirituality, is more generous than all our mistakes put together. And the home that is purified with love and with faith does not simply recover what it had lost. It receives something new that it did not have before. That is what makes this warning good news, not a condemnation, not a reproach, a door, a concrete invitation to do something that will change the spiritual environment of your home in a way that you and those you love will feel, not in dramatic or spectacular terms, but in the quiet, deep terms in which grace always works. The prayer that begins to require less effort. The peace that begins to settle into rooms that once carried an unexplainable heaviness. The new ease of kneeling and feeling that heaven is closer than it was yesterday. But there is something more that Saint Teresa of Avila wanted to point out about these 4 plants. Something that goes beyond the interference they create in individual prayer. It has to do with children, with the little ones growing up in those homes, with the young souls being formed in a space where 2 spiritual orders coexist without resolution, absorbing that tension without yet having the tools to understand what they are absorbing. Saint Teresa of Avila was acutely aware of this. In the Foundations, she writes about how important it is that the environment where young souls are formed be ordered, clean, free from mixtures that create confusion before faith has had a chance to put down deep roots. Because the child who grows up in a home where the rosary is prayed alongside aloe vera hanging at the door, where the image of Our Lady shares space with lucky bamboo, where devotion to the saints coexists with rue in the garden, is receiving a spiritual formation with an invisible fracture at its foundation. A fracture that doesn't always produce dramatic consequences in childhood, but that in adolescence or adulthood can open in ways that leave the soul without the firm ground it needs to hold on to faith. How many devoted mothers who wonder why their children drifted from the church, why the faith they worked so hard to pass on never took root the way they'd hoped, why the devotion they tried to share never caught fire in those young hearts the way it burned in their own. Saint Teresa of Avila would not say the answer always lies in the plants of the home, but she would say that the spiritual environment in which a soul is formed matters far more than the modern world is willing to admit, and that purifying that environment is one of the most profound acts of love a mother can offer her children. Not because removing 4 plants will solve every problem, but because it is an act of clarity, of intention, of deciding that this home belongs to God without mixture or compromise. And that decision has spiritual consequences that reach far beyond what any human eye can measure. There is still something we have not yet said. Something Saint Teresa of Avila would always add at the end of this teaching, when the families had understood the problem and were ready to act. Something that transforms the act of removing these plants into a spiritually complete moment, not merely a bit of housekeeping. It has to do with what you place in their stead. Because a home emptied of what was blocking grace needs to be filled with something. And Saint Teresa of Avila was very clear about which plants, which elements, which living presences belong to the order of grace and can rightfully take the place of what is left behind. When Saint Teresa of Avila spoke of what ought to fill the Christian home after purification, she was not speaking of emptiness, not of stark austerity, not of bare spaces where beauty disappears along with the problematic plants. She spoke of substitution, of conscious replacement, of the active decision to fill the newly purified space with elements that fully belong to the order of grace, and that actively help create the environment God intends for the Christian home. Because there are plants that do belong to that order, plants the Christian tradition has recognized and blessed for centuries, plants whose presence in the home does not create interference but diminishes it, plants that accompany prayer rather than obstruct it, and Saint Teresa of Avila knew them well. She lived surrounded by them in the gardens of her convents, where the plant life was itself part of her sister's spiritual life, tended with attention and care. The first is rosemary. In the Christian tradition, rosemary carries a history of devotion reaching back to the earliest centuries. The oldest legend connects it to the flight into Egypt, when the Virgin Mary spread her blue mantle over a white flowering rosemary bush, and the blossoms changed color forever. Whether history or legend, that story reveals the place rosemary holds in the Christian spiritual imagination. It is a plant of Marian protection, of consecration, of sacred presence. In medieval European homes, it was planted beside the door as a sign of dedication to Our Lady. At Catholic weddings, it adorned the altars as a symbol of faithfulness and blessing. It is a plant with centuries of history within the order of Christian grace, and its presence in the home carries that history with it in a way that Pothos or lucky bamboo never could. The second plant, Saint Teresa of Avila considered fitting for the Christian home, is the lily. It is not always practical to grow in a pot, but where the garden allows, the lily is a presence the Church has associated since ancient times with purity, with the Annunciation, with the nearness of angels. In Christian iconography, the angel Gabriel always carries a lily when he appears before the Virgin Mary. It is the flower of perfect purity, of total consecration, of the space where the divine enters without resistance, because everything has been prepared to receive it. A home with lilies in its garden or its window has chosen, perhaps without quite knowing it, to align itself with some of the deepest symbolism of the Christian faith. And then there is the olive. Not always possible in every climate, but where it can grow, it represents in the Christian home something that no other plant can represent with the same depth of sacred meaning. The olive is the plant of peace, of the Holy Spirit, of the reconciliation between heaven and earth. The olive branch the dove carried back to Noah was the first sign that God had forgiven. The Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus prayed in an agony of blood before his passion, was surrounded by olive trees. The oil the Church uses in her sacraments comes from the olive. A deeper rootedness in sacred history is almost impossible to imagine. But what Saint Teresa of Avila wanted families to understand is not simply that they swap one set of plants for another. That would reduce her teaching to a kind of domestic recipe. What she wanted to convey is something deeper. It is the understanding that the act of consciously choosing what inhabits your home is itself a spiritual act, a declaration, a form of prayer that uses not words but decisions. Every time you choose to place in your home an element that belongs to the order of grace, you are saying something. You are saying that this space is God's, that in this home, the rules of His kingdom take precedence over any other spiritual logic. That grace is welcome here, fully, without conditions, without interference. And that declaration carries a power that Saint Teresa of Avila did not hesitate to call extraordinary. Not because plants have any magic in them, but because the conscious intention of a heart that chooses to live in order with God moves something in the spiritual environment of the home that no external circumstance can stop. Grace responds to disposition, and disposition is expressed in part through what we choose to have around us. There is something Saint Teresa of Avila would always add to this teaching, something that her sisters and the families who consulted her found particularly consoling because it touched on something everyone felt but no one dared to name. The question of time lost, of the years the problematic plants had been in the home without anyone knowing, of the grace that could have been poured out and never arrived because the environment was not prepared to receive it. Saint Teresa of Avila would look at those who raised this with her, with that serenity that was one of her most characteristic gifts, and say something that remains true today, centuries after her lips first spoke it. God does not count time the way we do. What for us looks like a delay, for Him is a preparation. And the home that opens itself to grace after years of interference does not receive less grace for having taken so long. It receives exactly the grace it needs in the exact moment it is ready to receive it, because that is who God is. That is how generous He is. That is how patient. That is how utterly incapable of arriving too late to a heart that finally opens the door to Him without reservation. What remains to be said is the most practical part, the next step, the specific action that transforms everything you have heard into a real change in your home. Because Saint Teresa of Avila never left anyone with understanding alone without accompanying it with something they could do. The deepest mysticism in the Christian tradition always ends in an act. And the act she recommended to seal the purification of the home is something you can do today, right now, before this day is over. The time has come for action. And Saint Teresa of Avila, who was always a woman of action as much as contemplation, who founded 17 convents traveling the dusty roads of Spain with a determination that astonished everyone who knew her, never wanted her teachings to end in pure understanding without being translated into something concrete that the soul could do with its hands and its will. Mysticism without action was, for her, incomplete mysticism. And the purification of the home you have understood today needs a concrete step in order to become real. The first step is the simplest and the most important. Remove the plants, not with anxiety, not with the dramatic gesture of someone who has just discovered they have been living in error, but with the serenity of one who has received a light and acts on it with gratitude and peace. Saint Teresa of Avila insisted on this just as firmly as she insisted on the action itself. The manner in which a spiritual thing is done is part of the spiritual thing itself. Removing the Pothos, the rue, the lucky bamboo, the aloe vera from the threshold with anxiety or guilt charges that moment with an energy it does not deserve. Removing them with peace, with a quiet prayer in the heart, with the clarity of one who is setting the home in order for God, transforms a domestic task into an act of consecration. The prayer Saint Teresa of Avila recommended to accompany the purification of the home was not a complicated formula. It was what she always recommended for moments when the soul makes a decision of spiritual consequence. A prayer of your own, born from the heart, spoken directly to God, without intermediaries or rituals belonging to no tradition of the Church. Something as simple as this: Lord, this home is yours. Whatever was in it that did not belong to you, I remove today. I ask you to fill it with your grace. May every corner of this house receive your light. May nothing here obstruct the prayer of those who live in this space. May this home be your territory, completely yours, without mixture or reservation. That prayer made with faith and the sincere will to act on it, has doekdi, according to Saint Teresa of Avila, an immediate effect on the spiritual environment of the home. Not because words have magical power, but because they express a disposition of the heart that God takes seriously and answers with that generous promptness that is one of his most consoling attributes. The soul that is disposed for grace does not wait in vain. Grace comes, sometimes in a way that can be felt right away, sometimes in a quiet way that is only recognized afterward, when you look back and see that something changed without there having been a single precise moment when the change occurred. The second step is the blessing of the home. If it is possible, invite a priest. The blessing of a home by an ordained minister carries a sacramental efficacy that no private action can fully replace. But if that is not immediately possible, the Church permits and encourages the blessing of the home by the father or mother of the family, using holy water, moving through each room in faith, tracing the sign of the cross on doors and windows, calling on the protection of the Most Holy Trinity over every space. This practice has centuries of history in the Catholic tradition. It is concrete, it is effective, and it is exactly the kind of act that Saint Teresa of Avila would have recommended to seal the purification that the removal of the plants has begun. The third step is conscious substitution. Do not leave the space empty. Bring into the home something that belongs to the order of grace. A rosemary plant near the door, consecrated in your heart to Our Lady's protection. A new image to fill the place where the lucky bamboo stood. A crucifix in the corner where the rue grew. Not because sacred objects are talismans that operate by their own force, but because they are signs of a decision, markers of an intention, silent declarations of who this space belongs to. And the fourth step, the one Saint Teresa of Avila considered the most important of all, is perseverance. The purification of the home is not a single event. It is a permanent disposition, an attitude that renews itself each day in small decisions about what enters the space where faith is lived, which gifts are accepted, which customs are kept, and which are examined in the light of a mature faith, what is passed down from previous generations, and what is let go of with love, with gratitude, but with clarity. Saint Teresa of Avila lived this perseverance in her own life. She reformed the Carmelite order not with a decree, but with a decision she renewed every day for decades, in every convent she founded, in every sistel she formed, in every letter she wrote. And it is that same perseverance she asks of the Christian home that truly wants to be God's territory. Not the perfection of a single day, the faithfulness of every day. The attentive eye that does not grow comfortable with disorder, but notices it and corrects it with the serenity of one who knows that God deserves the very best we can offer. Your home can be that space. It can be the place where grace flows without obstruction, where prayer rises without hitting a wall, where those you love grow up in an environment that holds them in faith rather than complicating it. Saint Teresa of Avila saw this as possible for every family willing to take this teaching seriously, and it remains possible today for you, for the ones you love, for this home, which from this day forward will never be quite the same, because you listened, you understood, and you chose to act. That is all Saint Teresa of Avila ever wanted. Not fear, not guilt, light, and the free, loving decision to live in that light without reservation. You made it to the end, and that is not an accident. People who stay with a teaching like this from beginning to end are not people looking for spiritual curiosities to pass the time. They are people who feel it in the deepest part of their heart, that something in their home, in their life of faith, in that space where they try each day to live close to God, needs an order they have not yet quite found. And today, that order has a name, it has a cause, and it has a solution. Today, you learned what Saint Teresa of Avila warned about 4 plants found in millions of devout homes right now, quietly blocking something that God wants to pour out upon those families with a generosity that knows no limit. You learned that the Pothos carries with it an energetic logic that does not belong to the Christian order. That root has been entangled for centuries with practices the Church has never blessed, even if no one in your family ever knew it or consciously chose it. That lucky bamboo is a spiritual power object within a tradition that is not yours, and that its function does not disappear because the person who bought it was unaware of it. And that aloe vera, that beloved familiar plant, so charged with memories of grandmothers and childhood gardens, holds a central place in the syncretic religious life that has lived for centuries alongside popular Catholicism. Unexamined in the light of the mature faith, Saint Teresa of Avila wanted for every Christian serious about their interior life. You also learned that God does not charge us for what we did not know, that ignorance does not close heaven, it only waits to be illuminated, that the home which opens itself to grace after years of interference does not receive less grace for having taken longer, that God is more generous than all our mistakes combined, and that the purification of the home Saint Teresa of Avila taught is not a condemnation but a doorway, a concrete invitation to make space for something that has been waiting to enter. That is what you received today. Not fear, not guilt, light. The same light that Saint Teresa of Avila always wanted for every soul who came to her, trying to understand why the faith they professed sincerely was not bearing in their lives and their homes all the fruit that God had promised. And that light does not stay in the understanding, it becomes action. The serene and loving decision to set the home in order for God, without reservation, without mixture, with the clarity of one who knows whose space this is. You can take that first step today, right now, before this day ends. Remove with peace what does not belong to the order of grace. Pray with the simplest words that rise from your heart. Trace the sign of the cross in each room with holy water. And let God do what He has always wanted to do in your home, what the disorder of the environment had been making difficult. What you feel afterward will not resemble any extraordinary phenomenon. It will resemble what grace always resembles when it arrives without obstruction. Peace, lightness, that new ease in prayer that you did not know was missing until at last you have it. Saint Teresa of Avila walks with you in that step. She who purified convents and souls and homes for decades with a patience and a clarity that time has not been able to erase, walks with you today toward that first gesture of consecration. And her intercession before God for the homes that take her teaching seriously is among the most powerful that heaven can offer to a family seeking to live in the fullness of grace. Now I want to say one more thing to you, because what you received today is only a part of what Saint Teresa of Avila left written for Christian homes. Only one doorway into a teaching that has more depth, more layers, more richness than any single video could exhaust. And something is waiting for you in the next one you'll watch. Something Saint Teresa of Avila taught about the objects that should be in the Christian home, the ones that not only do not block grace, but actively draw it in with an intensity that the Catholic mystical tradition describes with remarkable precision. Objects you may already have in your home without fully knowing what they do. Objects you may never have had, and that once you know about them, you will want to seek out. That teaching is in what YouTube will show you now as this video ends. Don't put it off until tomorrow. The soul that has received light today is in the best moment to receive more. Grace calls to grace, and what Saint Teresa of Avila still has to say to you about the Christian home is too important to leave waiting. There are families who have completely transformed the spiritual atmosphere of their home by applying one teaching at a time, with patience, with faithfulness, without rushing but without stopping, as Saint Teresa of Avila herself might have said, with that practical wisdom that meant her words always reached the heart without losing themselves in the clouds. You can be one of those families. Your home can be that territory of grace God intends it to be. And the path begins exactly here, exactly today, exactly with this step you have already decided to take. I leave you with the tenderness with which Saint Teresa of Avila parted from the souls she loved, with the certainty that what you heard today was not coincidence but providence, with the peace of one who knows that God watches over homes that open themselves to Him without reservation. In her own words, Saint Teresa of Avila wrote, "Let nothing disturb you, let nothing frighten you. All things pass. God does not change, and that includes your home. That home which from today, with the grace of God and the intercession of Saint Teresa of Avila, will never be quite the same. May God bless every room in your house, every door, every window, every soul sleeping under that roof tonight, and may the most blessed Virgin cover it with her mantle forever. Amen."